Before the documentary begins, I would like to provide a brief in a few lines first on the title. 1,000 Years of Muslim Rule in the Subcontinent, Hidden Truths They Never Taught You. For 1,000 years, thrones rose and crumbled across the subcontinent. Swords clashed, crowns shifted, and empires that once shaped the destiny of millions vanished without a trace. But what if the story we think we know is incomplete? Imagine a land where a teenage commander arrives from a distant desert and plants the first seed of a new empire, where dynasties built cities of marble, gold, and poetry, where faith, power, betrayal, and ambition battled silently behind palace doors, and where the final ruler, sitting in his candlelit fort, never imagined his bloodline's 1,000-year legacy would end in exile. This is the untold story of how Muslim rule began, grew, flourished, and shattered across the Indian subcontinent. A story of courage and conquest, a story of unity and war, a story that shaped the identity of nearly half the people living here today. Stay with me, because the truth behind these 1,000 years is far more gripping than what our history books ever dared to reveal. Before we begin this journey through time, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this eye-opening historical series. Because what you're about to discover will change the way you see history forever. Major Muslim dynasties that ruled the Indian subcontinent, approximately. Period from 711 to 1948 Anno Domini, covering present-day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. First, I enlist all chapters in one place, so that this historical documentary could easily understandable. I divided whole of the documentary in 7 chapters. These are: Chapter 1, Early Muslim Rule. In Sindh, Chapter 2, Afghan and Turkic Muslim Empires. Chapter 3, Delhi Sultanate, 5 Dynasties. Chapter 4, Regional Muslim Sultanates, outside Delhi rule. Chapter 5, the Mughal period. Chapter 6, post-Mughal princely Muslim rule. Chapter 7, British Crown moreover. Each chapter further divided into parts, in which these are. Chapter 1, Early Muslim rule in Sindh has 5 parts. First Dynasty, Umayyad Caliphate, Sindh Governorate, period 711 to 756, Anno Domini. Second Dynasty, Abbasid Caliphate, Governors. In Sindh and Multan, period 750 to 982, Anno Domini. Third Dynasty, Habbari Dynasty of Sindh, period 982 to 1010, Anno Domini. Fourth Dynasty, Soomra Dynasty, local Sindhi Muslim rulers, period 10th to 11th century and onward. 5 Dynasty, Sama Dynasty of Sindh, period 11th to 14th century. Chapter 2, Afghan and Turkic Muslim Empires has 2 parts. 6th Dynasty, Ghaznavid Empire, period 977 to 1186, Anno Domini. 7th Dynasty, Ghurid Empire, period 1153 to 1215, Anno Domini. Chapter 3, Delhi Sultanate, 5 dynasties divided into 5 parts. 8 Dynasty, Mamluk, Slave Dynasty, period 1206 to 1290, Anno Domini. 9 Dynasty, Khilji Dynasty, period 1290-1320, Anno Domini. 10 Dynasty, Tughlaq Dynasty, period 1320-1414, Anno Domini. 11 Dynasty, Sayyid Dynasty, Payod, 1414-1451, Anno Domini. 12 Dynasty, Lodi Dynasty, period 1451-1526, Anno Domini. Chapter 4, Regional Muslim Sultanates outside Delhi rule are divided into 7 parts. 13 Dynasty, Bengal Sultanate, period 1352 to 1576, Anno Domini 14 Dynasty, Bahmani Sultanate, Deccan, period, 1347 to 1527, Anno Domini 15 Dynasty, Deccan Sultanates, 5 states, period 1527 to 1686, Anno Domini, Ahmadnagar, Berar, Bidar, Bijapur, Golconda 16 Dynasty, Gujarat Sultanate, period 1407 to 1573, Anno Domini 17 Dynasty, Malwa Sultanate, period 1401 to 1562, Anno Domini 18 Dynasty, Jaunpur Sultanate, period 1394 to 1479, Anno Domini 19 Dynasty, Khandesh Sultanate, Faruqi Dynasty, period 1382 to 1601. Anno Domini, Chapter 5. The Mughal period also divided into one part, 20 Dynasty, Mughal Empire, period 1526 to 1857. Anno Domini, Chapter 6. Post-Mughal princely Muslim rule divided into one part, 20. One Dynasty, Nizam of Hyderabad, Asaf Jahi Dynasty, period 1724 to 1948, Anno Domini, Chapter 7. British Crown is divided into one last part, the period from 1857 to 1947 under the British Crown. Let us now begin the complete documentary on Title, 1,000 Years of Muslim Rule in the Subcontinent. Hidden Truths They Never Taught You. Chapter 1. Early Muslim Rule in Sindh First Dynasty. Umayyad Caliphate, Sindh Governorate, period from 711 to 756. Anno Domini the arrival of the Umayyads in Sindh during the early 8th century marked the first chapter of Muslim rule in the Indian subcontinent. The period from 711 to 756 is remembered for Muhammad bin Qasim's campaign and the establishment of the Sindh Governorate under the Umayyad Caliphate. It began with a mix of political, commercial, and humanitarian motivations that developed into long-term administrative presence. At that time, Sindh was a land of thriving trade ports, river-based settlements, diverse faith communities, and local dynasties, mainly the Brahmin rulers headed by Raja Dahir. The region had long-standing commercial and cultural links with Arabia due to sea trade across the Arabian Sea. Arab merchants had been visiting coastal towns, including Dabal, for generations. This familiarity made Sindh a known land rather than a mysterious new frontier. Still, a formal expansion was triggered by a chain of events that involved piracy, requests for justice, and strained diplomacy. Historical accounts narrate that a ship carrying widows and children of Muslim traders was attacked near the coast of Sindh, and the passengers were taken captive. Their cries for help reached the Umayyad governor of Iraq, who forwarded the matter to the caliph. Diplomatic attempts to secure the release of detainees failed. The incident coincided with Umayyad interest in securing the trade route between the Arabian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Caliph al-Walid approved a military expedition, and Muhammad bin Qasim, only in his late teens but well-trained in governance and warfare, was appointed to lead the mission. His campaign began with a calculated and systematic march towards Sindh, supported by cavalry, infantry, and siege equipment, as well as a naval element. The first major challenge was the port of Dabal, a fortified harbor city that controlled entry to the Indus Delta. After a siege, the city fell, opening the gateway to the rest of Sindh. As Muhammad bin Qasim advanced, a blend of resistance, negotiation, and support shaped his progress. He moved toward Niran, Sewan, and eventually towards Rawar and Aror, where the decisive confrontation with Raja Dahir took place. The victory over Dahir marked a turning point. Many local groups who were unhappy with the heavy taxation and rigid rule of the Brahmin elite accepted the new order. Muhammad bin Qasim's policy for conquered people was a key factor that helped consolidate authority. He practiced a structured system that allowed local communities to retain property, continue practicing their faiths, and preserve social order as long as they accepted the new administration and paid taxes. The classes known as Jats and Buddhists, who had faced discrimination under the previous rule, found more inclusion under the new arrangement. Rather than imposing a new culture overnight, the administration introduced gradual reforms that aligned with local customs and Islamic governance principles. This helped reduce friction. The administration centered around establishing Sindh as a province of the Umayyad Empire. Mansoura was developed as the capital, and taxes were reorganized to ensure fairness. People who embraced Islam were exempted from certain taxes, but the non-Muslim population was treated as protected citizens. Trade resumed quickly, and agricultural systems continued to function, ensuring stability and revenue. Communication lines with Basra and Damascus strengthened political links. Arabic began to spread alongside existing languages, creating a multicultural environment. Coins were issued, and legal reforms introduced Islamic principles while also respecting local practices in day-to-day life. Judges and officials were appointed to handle justice, record-keeping, and revenue collection. Throughout this period, the Umayyads did not attempt to erase the local cultural identity. Instead, they integrated the region through administration, trade, language, and inter-community cooperation. A key outcome of this period was the introduction of Islamic jurisprudence alongside prevailing regional customs. Mosques and educational circles emerged. Traders from across the Arabian region began to settle in Sindh. The cities along the Indus became hubs of movement. Between South Asia and the Middle East, the campaign also played a role in extending Arab maritime influence deeper into the Indian Ocean. As stability grew, Sindh became a connecting point in the trade network that linked China, Sri Lanka, Arabia, and Persia. The death of Caliph al-Walid and later political changes in Damascus affected the continuity of support for the Sindh governorate. Internal shifts in the Umayyad Empire and power contests reduced focus on the eastern provinces. Muhammad bin Qasim was recalled, and the leadership in Sindh began to change hands more quickly. These disruptions weakened the early administrative foundation. Even so, the presence of Muslim governance in Sindh did not collapse with the end of Muhammad bin Qasim's tenure. The region remained under Umayyad influence until the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate itself in 750 and then transitioned into Abbasid rule. The significance of the Umayyad period in Sindh goes beyond military conquest. It marked the introduction of Islam to the subcontinent through structured governance rather than temporary raids. It opened a new chapter of cultural exchange, intellectual contact, and administrative evolution. The foundations created during this time allowed later dynasties, including the Abbasids and regional Muslim rulers, to build on what was already established. The campaign set in motion social and cultural developments that eventually influenced the identity of the region. The Sindh Governorate, under the Umayyads, stands as the first bridge between the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent, shaping relations that would continue for centuries. Second Dynasty, Abbasid Caliphate, governors in Sindh and Multan, period 750 to 982. Anno Domini, the arrival of the Abbasids to power in the wider Muslim world created a new political and administrative phase for Sindh and Multan between 750 and 982. When the Umayyad Caliphate ended, the province of Sindh was brought under the authority of the Abbasid Caliphate, and this shift in control introduced new policies, new officials, and a stronger connection with the evolving intellectual and administrative style of Baghdad. Although the early Abbasid period in Sindh did not involve dramatic conquests like those of Muhammad bin Qasim, it played a major role in stabilizing the region and shaping the long-term presence of Islam in the subcontinent. The Abbasids did not view Sindh only as a frontier outpost. They recognized its strategic value for trade, revenue, and cultural influence, especially due to its position as a gateway between the Arabian and Indian worlds. The new rulers continued the administrative framework left by the Umayyads, yet they refined it with their own emphasis on centralized authority, record-keeping, and cultural integration. Governors were appointed directly by the Abbasid caliphs and were expected to maintain loyalty and send revenues to Iraq. Mansoura became the central administrative capital, and Multan developed into a secondary yet highly important center. Multan emerged as a significant city not only for trade and agriculture, but also for its growing scholarly and religious status. Its location at the crossroads of trade routes connected it with caravans to Afghanistan, Iran, and northern India. Because of this, Multan became a cultural and intellectual link between Baghdad and the Indian subcontinent. Under Abbasid rule, one of the main priorities was the development of a more robust bureaucratic structure. Officials were appointed to oversee taxation, legal affairs, and religious matters. Arabic became the language of administration and record-keeping, while local languages and customs continued in daily life. The Abbasids encouraged the spread of Islamic education and learning, and small circles of scholars began appearing in Sindh, particularly associated with mosques that doubled as community centers for learning. The region saw the introduction of the Arabic script in local inscriptions and coinage, with coins issued bearing the names of Abbasid caliphs. This helped integrate Sindh into the wider Muslim economic and political system. Additionally, Islamic law began to take deeper root alongside local customs, gradually shaping societal norms. Unlike the Umayyad period, where the initial years involved military campaigns and resistance, the Abbasid era in Sindh is largely remembered for calm governance, integration, and cultural transition. The locals gradually adjusted to the new system. Many segments of society saw benefits in aligning with the administration, especially merchants, artisans, and farmers who gained access to wider trade networks. Islam continued to spread, not only through rulers and officials, but also through traders, scholars, and early preachers who settled in the region. Coastal and river-based trade flourished, linking Sindh with Basra, Hormuz, Sri Lanka, and China. Export of textiles, grain, ivory, minerals, and handcrafted goods continued to generate prosperity. This made Sindh attractive for migrants from other Muslim regions who settled and contributed to the evolving cultural identity of the province. The Abbasid period also witnessed occasional local uprisings and power contests. Since the central authority was far away, some Arab tribes and local families sought autonomy or influence. Tribal tension, power rivalries between Arab settlers, and friction with certain Hindu elites surfaced at times. In response, governors were sometimes changed quickly to maintain control. Yet most conflicts were contained without large-scale disruption. Over time, mixed communities emerged. Intermarriages, settlement of Arab families, and adoption of local customs resulted in a blended culture. Sindh gradually witnessed the rise of families who developed their own regional influence, despite remaining under nominal Abbasid authority. Multan became a particularly influential city during this era. It became known for its religious scholarship. The region saw early development of theological discussions, especially among scholars connected with Basra and Kufa. Awareness of Islamic teachings grew through gradual efforts rather than forced conversions. Non-Muslims, including Hindus and Buddhists, were allowed to continue their practices as long as they paid the required taxes and respected the administration. This policy supported social harmony. Many locals converted willingly over generations because of economic and social advantages and growing interaction with Muslim communities. The Indus River continued to serve as the lifeline of agriculture, trade, and communication. With increased revenue flows, irrigation and agricultural organization strengthened. Farmers continued cultivation of wheat, rice, sugarcane, and cotton, with improvements in storage and distribution. By the 9th and early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate itself began to weaken due to internal struggles, distant revolts, and the rise of autonomous regional powers. As central authority declined, governors in Sindh gained more independence. Although they still acknowledged the Abbasid caliphs symbolically, the region moved closer to autonomous rule. Families with strong local roots and Arab ancestry began to exert regional authority, preparing ground for semi-independent dynasties. The most notable outcome of this transition was the emergence of the Habbari family, who would eventually form their own rule in Sindh. The shift from centrally appointed governors to semi-independent rulers did not break the Islamic identity of the region. Instead, it created a foundation for localized Muslim governance. The Abbasid rule in Sindh played a bridging role in the history of Muslim presence in the subcontinent. It moved the region from a phase of external military conquest and initial adjustment toward stability, integration, and cultural rooting of Islam. Administrative order, economic growth, spread of learning, and multicultural coexistence shaped the society. It was during this period that Sindh transformed from a frontier province into a recognized province of the Muslim world. The period laid a firm foundation for later Muslim rule in India, influencing governance patterns that would continue for centuries. Third dynasty, Habbari dynasty of Sindh, period 982 to 1010. Anno Domini. The rise of the Habbari dynasty in Sindh marked an important transition, from direct caliphal control to a more regionally rooted Muslim rule that lasted from 982 to 1010, as the influence of the Abbasid Caliphate weakened across distant provinces. Local leaders and influential families began assuming authority in various parts of the Islamic world. In Sindh, the Habbari family emerged as the most prominent among these local powers. Their rule represented a shift from a system where governors were appointed directly by Baghdad to one where governance was shaped by local dynamics, local alliances, and gradually increasing autonomy, while still maintaining religious and symbolic links to the wider Muslim world. The Habbari era is significant because it provided continuity of Muslim rule in Sindh and allowed the region to evolve its own identity within the Islamic cultural sphere. The foundations of the Habbari rule were laid during the late Abbasid period, when governors began exercising independent authority due to the diminishing control of the caliphate. The Habbari family belonged to Arab settlers who had established themselves in Sindh generations earlier. Their gradual rise to influence came through administrative competence, control of local resources, and the ability to maintain order and stability in a period of shifting power. When the Abbasid power weakened, the Habbari leader declared autonomy but continued to acknowledge the Abbasid caliph in name. This provided legitimacy to their rule and avoided direct confrontation with the caliphal authority. Their governance model became a blend of political independence and religious affiliation to Baghdad. Mansoura continued as the capital under the Habbari rule. The city had already been a significant administrative hub under earlier Muslim governors, and the Habbaris further developed it as their seat of power. Mansoura grew into a vibrant center of trade, culture, and religious scholarship. Local industries prospered, with weaving, pottery, metalwork, agriculture, and river-based trade playing important economic roles. The Indus River remained central to commerce, connecting Sindh with regions across the Arabian Sea as well as inland areas. As trade routes remained active, Sindh continued to attract traders, scholars, and migrants from the Islamic world. Markets and caravan routes linked Mansoura to Multan, Makran, Persia, and Central Asia. The Habbari administration maintained much of the administrative structure inherited from the Abbasids, but adapted it to regional needs. Local tribal chiefs and community leaders were given roles in governance, which ensured cooperation and reduced chances of rebellion. The legal system was based on Islamic principles, yet local customs continued to influence social and judicial matters. Taxation remained structured, with revenues collected from agriculture, trade, and crafts. A key feature of their governance was stability. Sindh did not witness large-scale conflict or oppressive rule during this period. As a result, society experienced a relatively peaceful era, with gradual cultural and religious transformation rather than forced change. The spread of Islam in Sindh deepened during the Habbari period. Although Islam had already taken root under Umayyad and Abbasid administrations, the Habbari rule saw a more organic form of expansion. Scholars, Sufis, and merchants played important roles in this process. Sufi presence began to grow and spiritual teachings attracted local populations. Conversion to Islam continued gradually, influenced by social interaction, marriage, trade, and cultural assimilation. The local population saw the emergence of a unique Sindhi Muslim identity. There was no cultural erasure. Instead, the interaction of Arab-Muslim culture with local Sindhi traditions created a blended regional culture. Language also reflected this combination. Arabic continued as a language of learning and religious scholarship. But Sindhi and other local languages remained dominant in daily life. Multan, although not directly under continuous Habbari control, remained an important neighboring center of Islamic influence. It developed into a prominent religious and academic city. Friendly relations and trade between Mansoura and Multan ensured cultural exchange and stability. At certain times, tensions or rivalries emerged with other regional powers, including tribes and neighboring dynasties. However, such disputes remained limited and did not destabilize the region significantly. The Habbari rule, though relatively peaceful and less militaristic compared to later dynasties in the subcontinent, played a vital role in the continuity of Islamic authority in Sindh. The rulers maintained diplomatic relations with the Abbasid Caliphate, often sending gifts or messages of loyalty. This symbolic allegiance prevented external interference. At the same time, the Habbaris strengthened local roots by integrating with the land, its people, and its customs. This localization of rule laid the groundwork for later dynasties in Sindh, ensuring that Muslim control did not collapse after the weakening of the central caliphate. Toward the end of the 10th century, the regional political landscape began changing as new powers arose in the subcontinent and beyond. The Ghaznavid Empire, expanding from Afghanistan under Subuktigin and later Mahmud of Ghazni, viewed Sindh as strategically significant. Mahmud Ghaznavi, seeking control over trade routes and eager to extend his influence, eventually moved towards Sindh. Around 1010, the Ghaznavids ended Habbari rule and absorbed Sindh into their empire. This marked the transition from a locally rooted autonomous dynasty to a new phase of Turkish-Afghan Muslim imperial rule in the region. Although the Habbari dynasty came to an end, its contributions continued to influence Sindh. The dynasty had allowed Sindh to retain its distinctive identity, ensuring continuity of governance, cultural development, and coexistence. The Habbaris preserved the early Islamic character of Sindh, while developing an environment that was locally integrated, economically active, and socially inclusive. This period kept the region connected with the Islamic world at a time when many provinces drifted into isolation after the decline of central caliphal power. The legacy of the Habbari rule lies in the fact that it maintained the earliest Islamic foundations in the subcontinent, nurtured stability, and acted as a bridge between early Arab rule and later dynasties. Fourth dynasty, Soomra dynasty, local Sindhi Muslim rulers, period 10th to 11th century and onward. Soomra dynasty occupies a significant place in the early history of Muslim rule in the subcontinent, particularly in Sindh, where it emerged around the 10th century and continued for several centuries. Unlike the earlier Arab and later Central Asian dynasties that established power through conquest, the Soomras were local Sindhi rulers who gradually embraced Islam and blended it with native traditions. Their rule marked the first instance where local Sindhi leadership took charge after decades of foreign governance under the Umayyads and Abbasids. This shift represented not only political change, but also the beginning of a unique cultural fusion between Islamic values and Sindhi heritage. The Soomra period laid the basis for a distinct Sindhi Muslim identity, shaped through local governance, Sufism, trade, and gradual Islamization. The background of the Soomra rise lies in the declining control of the Abbasid Caliphate over Sindh. After initial Muslim rule under the Umayyads and Abbasids, central authority weakened due to distance, internal conflicts, and emerging regional powers. By the 10th century, Arab influence in Sindh had diminished, and local chiefs began reasserting authority. It was during this transitional phase that the Soomras rose to power. The dynasty is believed to have originated in Lower Sindh, particularly around areas such as Thari, Thatta, and the coastal belt. The first notable ruler associated with establishing Soomra authority was Soomra I, though historical documentation about the earliest rulers remains limited. Over time, the Soomras consolidated control over wider regions including Thatta, Tharparkar, and parts of modern-day Badin and Hyderabad districts. What made the Soomra dynasty distinct was that it was indigenous. Unlike earlier governors appointed by distant caliphates, the Soomras represented the local population. Though the earliest Soomra chiefs were not fully Islamic in governance, the dynasty gradually embraced Islam, with later rulers adopting Muslim names and establishing mosques and Islamic institutions. This transition from indigenous traditions to Islamic rule was gradual and peaceful. The Soomras did not impose changes rapidly. Rather, Islamic culture blended with local customs, creating a distinctive Sindhi Muslim ethos. Over time, Sindhi language, literature, folk tales, and identity began reflecting Islamic influences, while still retaining regional flavor. The Soomra period saw Sindh develop semi-independent rule with administrative systems adapted to local realities. Rural chiefs, known as wadaras, played a role in governance, and land management was based on local agricultural patterns. The Sindh river system, fertile lands, and port access shaped the economy. Farming, fishing, and trade contributed to economic stability. Ports near the Arabian Sea enabled trade with Persia, Arabia, East Africa, and coastal India. This maritime activity encouraged cultural exchange and facilitated the spread of Islamic learning as scholars and traders interacted with Sindhi society. The Soomras maintained friendly ties with neighboring regions when possible, although they also faced challenges from rival powers. One of the biggest threats to Soomra authority came from the Ghaznavid and later Ghurid expansions into the subcontinent. While the Ghaznavids were focused more northward towards Punjab and the Ganges Plains, their influence extended indirectly into Sindh. The Soomras resisted full subjugation and retained autonomy, although at times they acknowledged nominal overlordship to avoid conflict. Their main rivalries, however, were with the Soomras' later successors and the upcoming Sama tribe, who eventually replaced the Soomras. Internal tribal conflicts also occasionally affected stability, as various branches of Soomra leadership competed for dominance. Yet despite these challenges, the dynasty endured for several centuries, demonstrating its local legitimacy and ability to govern through changing political conditions. Culturally, the Soomra period was important for the evolution of Sindhi society. Poetry, folklore, storytelling, and early forms of Sindhi literature flourished. The famous tragic love story of Sasui Punhun, rooted in the Soomra period, reflects themes of Sindhi culture, desert life, and social values that became part of Sindhi identity. While the definitive written literature began later, oral traditions during the Soomra era formed the foundation of Sindhi storytelling. Islam spread through Sufi influence rather than force, and this era saw the arrival of early Sufi saints in Sindh. Their teachings emphasized equality, compassion, spiritual depth, and integration of faith into daily life. The warmth and inclusiveness of Sufi thought resonated with local communities and became a defining feature of Sindhi Islam. The Soomras also shaped the social structure of Sindh. They maintained a balance between tribal systems, local customs, and the growing influence of Islamic law. Their rule helped bridge pre-Islamic Sindhi traditions and the Islamic social order that followed. As the dynasty progressed, more Islamic reforms entered society, mosques were built, and scholars contributed to religious learning. At the same time, local traditions, clothing, food, marriage customs, and music remained deeply rooted in Sindhi culture, creating a rich fusion rather than a cultural conflict. By the 14th century, the Soomra dynasty began losing influence due to internal weaknesses and external pressures. The Sama tribe, which had risen to prominence within Sindh, gradually replaced the Soomras as the dominant power. The transition from Soomra to Sama rule was relatively smooth compared to dynastic collapses elsewhere in the subcontinent, reflecting the local and tribal nature of Sindhi politics. The Soomra legacy, however, did not disappear with their fall. Many clans, families, and communities that trace origins to the Soomras remained influential in Sindh's social fabric. Their role in establishing local Muslim governance paved the way for later Sindhi Muslim dynasties such as the Samas and Talpurs. The significance of the Soomra dynasty lies in its role as the first local Muslim ruling house of Sindh. It represented a shift from foreign-appointed rule to indigenous leadership. It nurtured a unique Sindhi Muslim identity at a time when the subcontinent was experiencing major political transitions. The Soomras blended Islam with regional culture, supported local economy and trade, facilitated early Sufi influence, and laid foundations for a self-sustained Sindhi culture that survived through later centuries. Their era marked the beginning of a Sindhi-centric evolution of Muslim rule, rooted in the land, language, and culture of Sindh itself.